Welcome everyone, and thanks for watching. Settlers of Kalguur is looking incredibly ambitious and exciting for players like me who enjoy engaging mechanics, new build options, and changes to the meta. I'm sure I'll have lots of experimental builds to explore during the league, but with melee back on the menu, there is no better time to take a look at bleed. Those of you who have seen my Ignite video may have an idea of what's coming, but for everyone else, you're definitely going to want to watch to the end of the video. I won't have a specific build to showcase as the league hasn't even started yet, but we'll cover the mechanics of bleed, a variety of scaling methods, and an optimized comparison of every bleed skill. You can use the video chapters to skip ahead if you know what you're looking for, but for now, let's begin with the mechanics. Before we can make decisions about how to scale bleed, we need to know how it works. If you're already an expert, you can skip ahead, but this should be a good refresher for everyone. If a hit deals physical damage, we can apply bleed by stacking chance to cause bleeding, which is only available for attacks, but is plentiful on the tree, so hitting 100% is easy enough. Like other damaging ailments, the DPS of bleed is derived from the flat physical damage of the hit. Once flat added damage and conversion have happened, we end up with two separate damage sources, the attack and the bleed, each of which benefit from different things. Modifiers to bleed, ailment, damage over time, physical, and generic damage will apply, but modifiers to the attack type, like attack, melee, projectile, area, and weapon type damage, won't. Interestingly though, the bleed is still associated with the attack that applied it, so we end up with very specific wording like this. These lines don't apply, because bleed is not weapon damage, but this one does because it's the ailment created by the attack, and this one does because bleed is damage over time caused by a bow skill. The wording is all over the place, but PoE gets it right, so at least we have that. On top of that, we can scale damage over time multiplier, which starts at 100 or 150% for critical hits. And we can have bleeds deal damage faster, which proportionally increases the DPS while reducing the duration. That duration can be further improved with bleed or ailment duration, but not skill effect duration. On the receiving end, we can increase the enemy's damage taken or reduce their physical damage reduction. And there are a slew of other modifiers that affect the attack hit, like crit and double damage, but they come later in the calculation, so bleed doesn't benefit. Bleeds also have a unique property, which causes them to deal triple damage when the enemy is moving. We can force them to be moving with the Tempest rising, or we can apply aggravated bleeds, which are new to 325. It's possible to apply aggravated bleeds directly with Gladiator's Jagged technique, and to aggravate existing bleeds with nodes on the tree. A hit which aggravates bleeds on the target won't aggravate a bleed applied by that hit though, so you'll need to hit continuously. Now, like Ignite, enemies can have many bleed stacks on them, but they will only take damage from the highest DPS bleed at a given moment. This means we can use weapons with wide damage ranges, run things like volatility to widen it further, and apply multiple stacks. The more bleed stacks we can apply before the first one's duration expires, the higher we'll be in our damage range, on average. Alternatively, for fast-hitting skills, we can use the Crimson Dance keystone, which allows the damage from the top 8 bleeds to apply, but halves our bleed damage and disables the triple damage bonus from movement. Overall, we'd be dealing half of 8, which is quadruple damage, rather than the triple from default bleed, but we'll have a harder time achieving high rolls. Maintaining 8 high rolls is significantly harder than 1. On that note, PoE's calculation for the average roll is incorrect at the moment. It's accurate for default bleed, but with Crimson Dance, it effectively puts all of your bleed stacks into 8 buckets and takes the highest from each, which is notably lower than taking the top 8. I use the correct formula in my calculations later, and I'll see about getting it into PoE soon. But with all those tools at our disposal, we can carry on and consider the best ways to assemble a build. Your choice of attack and weapon will heavily influence the best way to scale bleed. There are a couple competing choices that will lead to drastically different builds, each of which will be optimal for some skills, but not others. I find that the reasonable builds can be divided along 2 axes, resulting in 4 general categories that we can analyze separately. The first axis is whether to build crit with the reworked Perfect Agony. The keystone requires us to crit in order to apply bleed, so our number of bleed stacks will scale with our crit chance, but it also causes our dot multi to be overridden by our crit multi for bleed, which is generally available in larger quantities. Melee builds can even consider running Abyssus if they can really solve their physical mitigation for a ton of crit multi and flat damage. Almost any bleed build will be centered at the bottom of the tree, where all the physical attack and bleed nodes are. Perfect Agony builds will reach up to the right, grabbing the keystone itself as well as crit and accuracy wheels, while non-crit builds will reach up to the left, grabbing Resolute Technique and dot multi-wheels instead. But several things will influence this decision, like weapon type, as some weapon types have options with better base crit than others. Those weapon types also tend to have strong crit wheels on the tree, so the weapon types available to each skill will be relevant. Available investment is also a major factor. Reaching a high crit chance takes significant investment, and it's very important for Perfect Agony because it effectively behaves like chance to hit. It'll affect the number of bleed stacks we can maintain, which will influence our bleed roll, and it'll affect the number of hits you have to make before you apply a bleed in the first place. You'll probably want to avoid Perfect Agony if it's early league, you're running a skill that doesn't easily maintain many bleed stacks, or you're committing significant investment towards defense or other scaling layers. But for fast-hitting skills which can apply an unreasonable number of bleed stacks and can fit adequate crit investment, we can also consider the new Rupture support gem. The gem lets our crits apply Rupture stacks, which grant more bleed DPS at the cost of drastically reduced duration. Now, the second axis is whether to use Crimson Dance, which will obviously favor fast-hitting skills. Builds which use the default bleed behavior will focus on two things: getting the damage bonus from movement, and using their many bleed stacks to fish for high rolls on a large damage range. For the former, we have a few options. The Tempest Rising will cause every enemy around us to count as moving, as long as we apply an elemental ailment. This makes for a nice synergy with Venopuncture, which chills any enemy we bleed and grants a big chunk of increased damage as a bonus. We could instead lean into the new passive tree nodes that aggravate bleeds on the target, but most of the large sources are conditional, with Perfect Agony builds having the best shot at consistency, thanks to the cornered prey wheel. But even still, the uncertainty can only be avoided by speccing into Gladiator's Jagged Technique node. As for the damage rolls, even slow-hitting skills will be able to maintain multiple bleed stacks with default bleed, so we'll always tend towards the top of our damage range. Rislatha's Coil is a popular option to widen the range, and it can be combined with a physical mastery and volatility support to maximize our top end. When using fast-hitting skills with the default bleed, having bleeds deal their damage faster becomes very important, as additional stacks have diminishing returns on increasing our damage roll. The Tempest Rising offers a good amount of this as well, making it a natural fit. And we can use supports like Swift Affliction, melee physical damage, or Vicious Projectiles, which have great multipliers at the cost of stacks. Perfect Agony builds can use the new Rupture support to push this to the extreme, while non-crit builds can use things like Ruthless or Fist of War to get significant multipliers on some attacks, effectively ignoring the stacks from unbuffed attacks. On the other side of things, builds using Crimson Dance don't have to worry about the movement bonus, and they sacrifice their ability to fish for high rolls in exchange for having their top 8 bleeds deal damage at once. We'll still benefit from high rolls if we can maintain many more than 8 stacks, so attack speed becomes more of a priority. With that in mind, we can drop the Tempest Rising and Rislatha's Coil in exchange for a more powerful charge stacking setup. Slayer's Masterful Form will let us stack Frenzy charges and gain an equal number of Endurance charges. Gladiators can grab the node with inevitably expensive Forbidden Flesh and Flame jewels, but there may even be a case to do the opposite, using the jewels to grab bleed explosions from Gladiator as a Slayer, as we don't need Jagged Technique. Those Endurance charges are a nice defensive boost, with the change to grant elemental damage reduction in 325, but they can also boost our damage with Disciple of the Unyielding and a Bleed Mastery for non-crit builds. The Frenzy charges inherently grant 4% attack speed and 4% more damage each, boosted further by Disciple of the Slaughter, but we can also use Alessia's Delight to gain Affliction charges instead, which grant 8% more damage with ailments each. When combined with Ralakesh's Impatience, we can have the best of both worlds, gaining Affliction charges while counting as having max frenzies. And to top things off, non-crit builds can use Usurper's Penance to capitalize on our frenzy charges, gaining dot multi and faster bleeds. To fuel the setup, we need as many max frenzies as possible. We'll add to the base 3 with 1 from Masterful Form, 1 from Alessia's, 1 from a Glove Corruption or Warlord mod, and 3 from the passive tree. For non-crit builds which path to the left side of the tree, the 2 frenzy nodes on the right need to be anointed, either on a Strangle Grasp or luckily found as a double anoint from Blight Ravaged maps. And that wraps up our initial quadrant of builds, but things don't stop there, as Crimson Dance bleeds and default bleeds are actually implemented as separate debuffs. If we can apply both, they will apply their damage independently. This is surprisingly achievable thanks to Farrul's Pounce, which grants us Crimson Dance during one of the rotating phases of Aspect of the Cat. I set up this test character with a large amount of life regen to offset the bleeds that I'll reflect to myself with the golden rule. You can see that a default bleed deals just enough damage to overcome the regen of 950 life per second, and 8 Crimson Dance bleeds deals a bit more, as expected. When applied back to back, we receive both debuffs and bleed out very quickly. I've checked the math, which confirms that we are taking the full combined damage of the 9 bleeds, with 8 being nerfed by Crimson Dance and ignoring movement, while the 9th deals its full damage, tripled by moving. I've also done a similar test on the enemy's health bar to make sure it wasn't a golden rule bug, and it showed the same behavior. Now, by default, Aspect of the Cat will alternate between 6 seconds of default bleed and 4 seconds of Crimson Dance, which leaves us with less time for the phase in which we need to apply the most bleeds. It also means that our bleeds need to last for the whole duration of the alternate phase, and we'll be missing out on applying additional stacks to get higher rolls during that phase. We can mitigate these issues somewhat by using Farrul's Fur, which equalizes the phase duration at 6 seconds each and conveniently removes the aspect's reservation, allowing us to comfortably link it with less duration. The phases are affected by skill effect duration, so this will bring them down to 2.4 seconds each, meaning we'll want around 5-second bleeds at a minimum. Since bleeds are 5 seconds by default, this means we can still use modifiers to make bleed deal damage faster, as long as we compensate with increased duration nodes as well. There's also some nice synergy with the charge stacking build, as we needed a way to generate frenzies to be converted into affliction charges, and since we'll have half as many stacks of each bleed type, the high variance build is less appealing anyways, so it seems natural to stick with the charge stacking for this approach. We will need a way to aggravate bleeds though, as we won't be using the Tempest Rising, and we only have Crimson Dance half the time, so it's likely that this variant will be a Gladiator dipping into Slayer for Masterful Form. So, that gives us 6 build variants. We can either build Crit with Perfect Agony on the right side, or stick to Resolute Technique on the left, and we can either use the default bleed to fish for high rolls on a wide damage range, focus on charge stacking with Crimson Dance, or combine the two with the Farrul's Pounce tech. For the sake of time, I won't cover the tools that every bleed build will use, but as you can imagine, they include auras like Malevolence and Pride, curses like Vulnerability and either Poacher's or Assassin's Mark, and the new War Banner. With this understanding of how to build each archetype for any given skill, we can now automatically optimize and compare all of our options. So, without further ado, flashbang warning. It is good to be back. Let's see what we're working with. In order to optimize every skill, we can start by recording the base properties of every pure physical attack in game. Everything from damage effectiveness to weapon restrictions and built-in multipliers. We can also record the base types for each weapon category and compute how well each would fit into the build archetypes mentioned previously. Based on those ratings, we can select the best option for each combination of build and weapon type. Finally, we can record stats from the passive tree wheels used by each build archetype, as well as the wheels available for each weapon type along the path. With all that information available, we can compute each damage scaling stat for a given build, making appropriate choices for gear, support gems, and tree pathing. And from there, we can run damage calculations for each weapon type, accounting for things like the number of bleed stacks maintained, our average bleed roll, the final damage range for each hit, and so on. Eventually, we arrive at total DPS numbers for each weapon type, from which we can select the best usable type and repeat for each build archetype. The results are aggregated here on the skill sheet, but the numbers here aren't real DPS numbers. They don't account for things like enemy physical reduction, banner usage, or anything else that could apply to every bleed setup. They also represent full single target damage, with no regard for the skill's coverage or ramp time. Those are things you'll need to consider for yourself when choosing a build, but these numbers can help you compare the top end of skills. The first 3 columns are the different approaches to max bleeds, using the strongest weapon available, while the next 3 are the same builds, but restricting themselves to one-handed weapons to use a shield, where possible. The same data can be viewed on the results sheet, with some more information about the winning configuration, like the weapon type and approach to crit. The chart sheet also offers a visual representation of the scores in sorted order. The results confirm a few well-known powerhouses, like Puncture with Snipe, Val Earthquake, Lacerate, and Lacerate of Hemorrhage even when using a shield. We can also see a handful of perfectly viable but previously unpopular options, like Earth Shatter of Prominence, Ground Slam of Earthbreaking, and Perforate of Bloodshed. We can also see a pattern emerging that aligns with previous expectations. Perfect Agony seems like a strong option for the default bleed build, which doesn't commit as much investment towards charge stacking and has plenty of excess bleed stacks. Resolute Technique performs better in the charge stacking Crimson Dance builds, which get a pile of dot multi from Usurper's Penance and the Bleed Mastery, which they'd rather not override with crit multi. If you'd like to review the results, I highly recommend visiting the link in the description to view the actual sheet, as I'll be making any bug fixes or improvements that I can leading up to league start. The builds used by the sheet are optimized for endgame, so I don't have a league starter to offer, but I hope the data inspires you to experiment with some new skills. I've included a simple PoE in the description which includes the base trees that the sheet branch off from, but it's not complete. If you thought this breakdown was cool, share it with a friend who might like it too. Like many players, I am very much looking forward to playing with the new Settlers mechanic and experimenting in the new meta, and I'll let you know if I come up with anything interesting. Until then, have a good one.